August 4, 1962. Marilyn Monroe's final 12 hours were filled with mysterious visitors, strange phone calls, and evidence that disappeared forever. What really happened will terrify you. August 4, 1962. 10:15 a.m. Marilyn Monroe woke up in her Brentwood home with no idea that she had less than 14 hours to live. But the events of that final day would reveal a conspiracy so dark, so carefully orchestrated, that the truth about her death has been hidden from the public for over 60 years. The morning began differently from any other day in Marilyn's life. She had been expecting to sleep late, as she usually did after taking her prescribed sleeping medication the night before. But she was awakened by the sound of voices in her living room. Voices that shouldn't have been there, voices that belonged to people she had never invited into her home. The first sign that something was catastrophically wrong came at 11:30 a.m. when Marilyn's housekeeper, Eunice Murray, found three men in dark suits standing in Marilyn's living room. They hadn't knocked on the front door. They hadn't rung the bell. They hadn't been invited by anyone. They were simply there, as if they owned the house, methodically examining Marilyn's personal belongings with the cold efficiency of government agents conducting a criminal investigation. "Miss Monroe," one of the men said when Marilyn appeared in her silk nightgown, her famous blonde hair disheveled from sleep, "we need to discuss some photographs you've been taking. Some recordings you've been making. Some conversations you've been having with people who trust you to keep their secrets safe." The lead agent was tall, thin, with the kind of expressionless face that suggested years of training in intimidation and violence. His two companions were younger but equally cold, their eyes scanning Marilyn's house as if they were already planning how to stage a crime scene. But Marilyn's terror was just beginning. These weren't the first uninvited visitors she had received that week, and the pattern of surveillance and intimidation had been building for months. For the past 6 months, Marilyn had been documenting her relationships with powerful political figures, including her intimate affairs with both President John F. Kennedy and Attorney General Bobby Kennedy. She had been secretly photographing classified documents that were carelessly left unguarded during private meetings, recording conversations that revealed government corruption and illegal activities, creating what she believed was an insurance policy that would protect her from anyone who might want to silence her permanently. What Marilyn didn't realize was that her insurance policy had actually signed her death warrant, marking her as a national security threat that needed to be eliminated before she could expose secrets that could destroy careers, topple administrations, and potentially alter the course of American history. The three men who appeared in her living room that morning weren't there to negotiate deals or make empty threats. They were there to finalize the operational details of her elimination, which had been scheduled to take place before midnight that same day. Every aspect of her murder had already been planned with military precision, from the specific method that would be used to kill her to the elaborate cover story that would convince the world she had committed suicide due to depression and drug addiction. "You have until 6 p.m. to turn over everything," the lead agent told Marilyn, his voice devoid of any emotion, humanity, or possibility of negotiation. "Every photograph, every recording, every document, every piece of evidence you've collected over the past year. If you comply fully and completely, we can discuss alternative arrangements for your future. If you don't comply, the alternative arrangements become unnecessary." Marilyn understood immediately what alternative arrangements meant in the language of government operatives. But what she didn't understand, what she couldn't have imagined, was that compliance would lead to exactly the same outcome as resistance. The men in her living room had no intention of letting her live regardless of her cooperation, because she had already seen too much, knew too much, and represented too great a risk to be managed through any means other than permanent elimination. The agents left at 12:15 p.m., giving Marilyn exactly 5 hours and 45 minutes to decide how she wanted to spend her final day alive. She used those precious hours to try desperately to save herself, making frantic phone calls to people she thought could protect her, attempting to negotiate for her life with former lovers who had become her enemies, and ultimately realizing that she had no allies powerful enough to stand against the forces that had been arrayed against her. Marilyn's first call was to Bobby Kennedy's private line at the Department of Justice, a number she had memorized during their affair and had used dozens of times to arrange secret meetings. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes and ended with Bobby hanging up on her when she tried to remind him of their relationship, the promises he had made to protect her, and the evidence she possessed that could destroy his political career. "Bobby, you know what I have," Marilyn pleaded, her voice shaking with fear and desperation. "You know what Jack told me, what you told me. I recorded everything, Bobby. I have photographs of documents, recordings of conversations. If something happens to me, it all comes out." Bobby's response was cold and final. "Marilyn, you need to understand that some things are more important than individual lives. Some secrets are worth any price to protect. Whatever you think you have, whatever you think you know, it ends today." Her second call was to President Kennedy's personal secretary, trying to reach Jack directly to plead for his intervention and remind him of their intimate relationship earlier that year. She was told that the president was unavailable and would remain unavailable indefinitely. The message was clear and brutal: she was on her own, abandoned by everyone who had once claimed to love her. But Marilyn's most devastating discovery came at 2:30 p.m. when she drove to the First National Bank of Beverly Hills to retrieve the evidence she had been collecting from her safety deposit box. She had rented the box under an assumed name 6 months earlier and had been systematically storing photographs, audio recordings, and copies of classified documents that she believed would guarantee her protection from powerful enemies. The box was completely empty. Every photograph, every recording, every document had been removed without her knowledge or consent. The bank manager claimed to have no record of who had accessed the box or when the contents had been taken, but his nervous demeanor suggested that he had been threatened or bribed into cooperating with the theft. Marilyn realized with growing horror that the government agents hadn't just been watching her recent activities, they had been anticipating her every move for weeks, possibly months. Her insurance policy had been neutralized before she even knew she needed it, leaving her completely defenseless against people who had unlimited resources and no moral constraints. At 4:15 p.m., Dr. Hyman Engelberg, Marilyn's personal physician, arrived at her house for what he claimed was an emergency medical visit. He told Marilyn that she had called his office earlier that afternoon complaining of severe anxiety and requesting immediate medication to help her cope with a mental health crisis. But Marilyn had no memory of making such a call, and her confusion grew when Dr. Engelberg insisted that she needed immediate medical intervention to prevent a complete psychological breakdown. Despite her protests that she felt fine, Dr. Engelberg administered an injection that he said would help stabilize her emotional state and prevent her from harming herself. "This will help you feel calmer," Dr. Engelberg assured her as he prepared the syringe. "You've been under tremendous stress lately, and your body needs medical support to cope with the pressure you're experiencing." Within minutes of receiving the injection, Marilyn began feeling confused and disoriented. Her speech became slurred, her movements unsteady, her thoughts clouded and difficult to organize. Dr. Engelberg assured her that these were normal side effects of the medication and would wear off within a few hours. But the injection wasn't medicine designed to help her, it was the first stage of Marilyn's murder, carefully designed to make her compliant and unable to resist what was going to happen to her later that evening. Dr. Engelberg had been compromised, either through threats or bribes, and was actively participating in her assassination. At 5:45 p.m., just 15 minutes before the deadline the agents had given her, Marilyn managed to call her psychiatrist Dr. Ralph Greenson despite the increasing effects of the drugs in her system. Her words were barely coherent, but she managed to convey that she was in immediate danger and needed help desperately. "Ralph, something's wrong," she whispered into the phone, struggling to form words as the barbiturates clouded her mind. "Men came to my house. They want to kill me. Dr. Engelberg gave me something. I can't think clearly. Please help me." Dr. Greenson promised to come to her house immediately, recognizing the genuine terror in Marilyn's voice despite her slurred speech. But by the time he arrived at 7:30 p.m., fighting through Los Angeles traffic in his desperate attempt to reach her, Marilyn was barely conscious and clearly in the advanced stages of drug-induced incapacitation. Dr. Greenson found Marilyn lying on her bed, surrounded by empty pill bottles that he knew she hadn't been taking because he had been monitoring her medication intake carefully as part of her psychiatric treatment. When he tried to examine her, he realized that she had been injected with a massive dose of barbiturates, far more than could be explained by any legitimate medical treatment or even by a serious suicide attempt. Her pulse was dangerously slow, her breathing shallow and irregular, her pupils dilated beyond what would be expected from oral medication. The injection sites on her arms and legs were clearly visible, indicating that she had been given multiple doses of drugs through different locations on her body. This wasn't suicide, Dr. Greenson would later write in his private medical notes, which were discovered decades after his death. This wasn't even an accidental overdose. Someone had injected Marilyn with enough barbiturates to kill several people. She was being murdered, and I was watching it happen without fully understanding what I was seeing. But Dr. Greenson's attempts to save Marilyn's life were interrupted at 8:15 p.m. when the same 3 government agents from that morning returned to her house, accompanied by 2 additional men who appeared to be medical professionals. They ordered Dr. Greenson to leave immediately and warned him that any attempt to summon additional medical help or contact law enforcement would result in his own unfortunate accident. Dr. Greenson, the lead agent, said with calm authority, "Your patient is experiencing a psychiatric emergency that requires specialized government intervention. Your services are no longer needed, and your continued presence here would compromise national security. We strongly recommend that you leave now and forget everything you've seen." Dr. Greenson was forced to abandon his patient, knowing that he was leaving Marilyn to die but powerless to prevent her murder without risking his own life and the lives of his family members. The agents had made it clear that resistance would result in consequences that extended far beyond his own personal safety. He would carry the guilt of that moment for the rest of his life, knowing that he had possessed the medical knowledge to save Marilyn Monroe but had been prevented from using it by people who represented the full power of the American government. The final hours of Marilyn Monroe's life were witnessed only by her killers and the people who had been paid to help cover up her murder. But years later, some of those witnesses began to talk, revealing the horrific details of how America's most beloved actress spent her final moments on Earth, alone and abandoned by everyone who had claimed to love her. At 9:30 p.m., Marilyn briefly regained consciousness as the barbiturates in her system fluctuated between lethal and sublethal levels. She tried to reach for the telephone on her nightstand to call for help, but discovered that the phone lines to her house had been disconnected by the agents to prevent her from summoning assistance. She attempted to walk to her car, thinking that she could drive herself to a hospital or at least to a public place where someone might help her. But the massive dose of drugs in her system made coordinated movement impossible, and she collapsed in her hallway, where the agents found her and carried her back to her bedroom. Marilyn's housekeeper, Eunice Murray, was present during these final hours but had been threatened into silence and forced to watch as the agents positioned Marilyn's body in her bed and carefully arranged empty pill bottles around the room to create the appearance of suicide by overdose. She was still breathing when they left, Murray revealed in interviews given decades later, shortly before her own death in 1994. She was still alive, but they knew she wouldn't survive the night. They had given her enough drugs to kill her slowly, over several hours, so that her death would look natural when her body was discovered. The agents had calculated the timing perfectly, ensuring that Marilyn would die during the early morning hours when no witnesses would be present and when her death could be attributed to a gradual overdose rather than acute poisoning. They had studied her medical history, her previous suicide attempts, her struggles with addiction, and had crafted a murder scenario that would be completely believable to investigators and the public. Marilyn Monroe died sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight on August 4, 1962, alone and abandoned by everyone who had claimed to love her, betrayed by the men she had trusted with her body and her secrets. Her body wasn't discovered until the next morning, when Eunice Murray called police to report finding her employer dead from what appeared to be an accidental overdose of sleeping medication. The Los Angeles Police Department's investigation into Marilyn's death was compromised from the very beginning, before the first detective arrived at the crime scene. Key evidence disappeared within hours of her death, witness testimonies were altered or suppressed, and the official cause of death was determined before the autopsy was even completed. Federal agents had infiltrated the investigation at every level, ensuring that no evidence of murder would be preserved and that all findings would support the predetermined conclusion of suicide or accidental overdose. Police officers who tried to investigate too thoroughly were transferred to different departments or forced into early retirement. But the most damning evidence of murder was found by Dr. Thomas Noguchi, the Los Angeles County coroner who performed Marilyn's autopsy. Dr. Noguchi was a meticulous professional who couldn't be easily intimidated, and his examination of Marilyn's body revealed conclusive proof that she had been murdered. There were no pill residues in her stomach, Dr. Noguchi wrote in his preliminary report. The barbiturates were introduced directly into her bloodstream through multiple injection sites on her arms, legs, and torso. The concentration of drugs in her system was far beyond what could be achieved through oral ingestion, even in cases of deliberate suicide. Dr. Noguchi's findings proved that Marilyn Monroe had not swallowed the pills found scattered around her bedroom. Instead, she had been injected with lethal doses of barbiturates by people who possessed medical knowledge and professional-grade equipment. This was not suicide, this was execution carried out by trained professionals. But Dr. Noguchi's findings were immediately suppressed by his superiors and never included in the official autopsy report that was released to the public. He was warned that revealing the truth about Marilyn's cause of death would not only end his career but potentially endanger his life and the lives of his family members. The coroner was forced to sign a falsified death certificate listing suicide as the cause of death, knowing that he was participating in a cover-up of murder but having no choice if he wanted to protect his loved ones from the same fate that had befallen Marilyn Monroe. The conspiracy to cover up Marilyn Monroe's murder involved dozens of people across multiple government agencies, from federal agents to local police officers to medical professionals to media figures who helped spread the suicide story through newspapers and television reports. Everyone who knew the truth was either threatened into silence or eliminated if they refused to cooperate with the cover-up. Dr. Engelberg, the physician who had administered the initial injection to Marilyn, died in a suspicious car accident just 6 months after her death, when his vehicle mysteriously crashed into a tree on a clear, dry road with no witnesses present. The accident report was filed and closed within 24 hours, with no investigation into possible mechanical failure or foul play. Eunice Murray, the housekeeper who witnessed parts of the murder, lived in constant fear for the rest of her life but eventually revealed the truth in interviews given shortly before her own death in 1994. She had been paid a substantial sum to maintain her silence and had been regularly visited by government agents who reminded her of the consequences of talking to reporters or investigators. Dr. Greenson, the psychiatrist who had tried to save Marilyn, spent the rest of his career secretly documenting evidence of her murder but never dared to make his findings public during his lifetime. His files, discovered in his home after his death in 1979, contained detailed proof that Marilyn Monroe had been systematically murdered by government agents acting on direct orders from the highest levels of American political power. The truth about Marilyn Monroe's final hours reveals that she died not as a tragic victim of mental illness and drug addiction, but as a woman who had been systematically murdered for possessing evidence that could have brought down the Kennedy administration, exposed decades of government corruption, and potentially altered the entire course of American political history. Marilyn's last coherent words, spoken to Dr. Greenson just hours before her death, were a desperate plea for justice that still echoes more than 60 years later. "Don't let them say I killed myself, Ralph. Don't let them make people think I was crazy or weak. I want everyone to know that I was murdered, and I want everyone to know why they killed me. The truth has to come out someday." More than 60 years later, that truth is finally being told. Marilyn Monroe's final hours were not spent in despair over failed relationships or career disappointments. They were spent fighting courageously for her life against powerful enemies who had decided that her knowledge of their crimes made her too dangerous to